The candles in Lady Eugenia Ravenscroft's dining room burned in 12-branched silver candelabra, and the light they gave was warm and absolute and entirely unkind to a gray cotton dress. Cecily had known this before she picked up the first soup tureen. She had known it, the way she knew the dimensions of the attic room where she now slept, and the particular creak of the third stair, and the hour at which the kitchen fire died down enough that her fingers went cold against the grate. She had come to know many things in the 5 months since her father's death. She had come to know, in particular, the specific weight of being seen without being looked at. The dining room held 14 guests. 14 people in silk and broadcloth and fine wool, their chairs pulled in around a table set with the good china, her mother's china, the china she had eaten from every Christmas she could remember, and not one of them raised an eye as she moved between their shoulders, with the tureen held level and her back held straight. That was the agreement, though no one had stated it. Servants did not exist in this room. They moved through it like weather. You did not look at weather. 14 guests. And then the Marquess of Ashcroft. He sat at Lady Eugenia's right hand, which was the position of highest honor at any table in Bath this autumn. And he did not look at Cecily in the way the others did not look at her. He did not look at her in a different way entirely. He did not look at her the way a person deliberately does not look at something they have already seen. She felt it between her shoulder blades when she turned to ladle soup for the gentleman at the far end. A quality of attention. A stillness directed her way from that corner of the table, steady and particular, and she could not have explained this to anyone without any pity in it at all. She did not turn around. Lady Eugenia laughed at something and touched the Marquess's sleeve, and the diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight and scattered it across the ceiling in small, cold constellations. And Cecily carried the empty tureen back to the kitchen, without looking once at the man who had not stopped watching her. Upstairs in the corridor outside, Lady Eugenia's private rooms, she had heard the name first spoken as it would be spoken for the rest of the season. She had been carrying linens when Lady Eugenia had said it to the lady's maid who had come with her from London. Said it lightly, dismissively, the way one identifies a problem already well in hand. If he notices the rag girl at dinner, you will make sure she is needed elsewhere. He has come to see Dorinda, and he will not be distracted by charity cases. The lady's maid had said, "Yes, my lady," and Cecily had stood very still in the corridor with the linens in her arms until the door closed, and then she had walked down to the linen cupboard and put the sheets away with great care, lining the folds exactly as she had been shown, because care was the one discipline she could still exercise, and she intended to exercise it perfectly. That had been the first evening of his visit. This was the second. She had learned, across 5 months in this house, that humiliation was bearable when it was predictable. What she had not learned, what she was learning now in the kitchen, as she set the tureen down on the scrubbed wooden table while the cook called instructions over her shoulder, was what to do with a pair of dark eyes that watched her as though she were worth the watching. It probably meant nothing. Men of his station noticed incongruities the way one noticed a stone out of place in a wall. She was incongruous. That was all. She smoothed her apron and went back upstairs. Her name before all of this had been Miss Cecily Ashmore. Her father had been Sir Harold Ashmore, Baronet. She had grown up in a house in Wiltshire with a library and a kitchen garden and 2 good hunters, and a mother who had died when Cecily was 11 and been mourned, genuinely and long. Sir Harold had married Lady Eugenia Forsyth, widowed Baroness. 3 years after, it had seemed reasonable at the time. Lady Eugenia had a daughter of her own, a pleasant and pretty girl named Dorinda, and she had managed the household with admirable efficiency, and had been for 7 years perfectly civil to Cecily, the way one is civil to a piece of furniture one has inherited, and has not yet decided what to do with. When Sir Harold died in February from a fever that moved faster than any of them had anticipated, Cecily had stood at his bedside and held his hand and watched the candle on the nightstand gutter in the draught from the window. And he had said to her as clearly as he had ever said anything, "The Virgil. Keep the Virgil." She had not known then which of the dozens of books in his library he meant. She found it the following morning in his coat pocket. A small, worn volume, its spine rubbed to illegibility, its pages annotated in his hand in the margins, small penciled notes, observations, arguments with a dead Roman poet. She had placed it in her apron pocket, and it had not left her person since. That afternoon, Lady Eugenia had explained the new arrangements. The explanation had been brief. The estate, such as it was entailed away from female inheritance. The house in Wiltshire had gone to her cousin in Surrey. Lady Eugenia, as widow, retained a life interest in the Bath townhouse and its contents. Cecily's allowance had ceased. With her father's death, Lady Eugenia was prepared to offer her continued residence in the house, in an appropriate capacity. "You are a sensible girl," Lady Eugenia had said, "and in a difficult position. I am giving you a home." What she was giving her was the attic room, the grey dress, the kitchen, and the stairs. Cecily had not wept. She had not argued. She had thanked Lady Eugenia with perfect composure, put on the grey dress, and gone to ask the cook what needed doing. She had done this for 5 months. She had polished the good silver. She had carried the coal scuttles upstairs before dawn, so that the fireplaces in the family rooms burned warm by the time Lady Eugenia descended. She had ironed Dorinda's dancing slippers with a heated cloth, so the satin lay perfectly smooth. She had done all of this with great care, because care was what remained to her, and she did not intend to let it go. She had thought, occasionally, of writing to her father's cousin in Surrey. She had thought of it the way one thinks of a shore that is visible from a boat already in deep water. Possible, perhaps, in theory. She had stayed. If you have ever watched a person hold themselves together by the simple force of deciding to, you may understand something of what Cecily looked like that autumn in Bath. Perhaps you have seen it in someone you love. Stay close. The Marquess of Ashcroft was in Bath because Lady Eugenia had written him 3 letters. She had been careful with the letters. Not obvious. She had mentioned Dorinda only once in each, and the mention had been seemingly incidental, a reference to a concert attended, a charity basket delivered, a small act of grace performed in a public room. What she had actually written, threaded through every line of each letter, was this: "Here is a girl who will not give you any trouble. Here is a girl who will sit at the head of your table and look beautiful and ask nothing of you. Here is a girl who will understand that what you need, after 3 years of silence, is someone who will require nothing." Dorian Blackwell, Marquess of Ashcroft, had read the letters with the particular attention he gave to documents that were trying to persuade him of something, and he had come to Bath not because he was persuaded, but because his solicitor had suggested the autumn waters, and because he had not left his Yorkshire estate in 14 months, and because staying had begun to feel like its own kind of dissolution. He was not, to be precise, looking for a wife. He was also aware that he had been watching a girl in a grey cotton dress carry soup across a dining room for 40 minutes, and that something about the way she moved, unhurried, perfectly level, self-contained in the particular way of a person whose composure has been tested so many times it has become structural, had made the dining room seem, in a way it had not seemed before, worth sitting in. He had not spoken to her. He had no occasion to speak to her. She was a servant, apparently, or something, approximating a servant, though her bearing was not the bearing of a girl born to it, and her hands, when he had been able to see them, were not the hands of a girl who had always worked with them. He kept these observations to himself. The morning of the 3rd day of his visit he encountered her in the corridor outside the morning room. She was carrying a coal scuttle in each hand. The scuttles were heavy enough that her arms were straight with the weight, and she was moving with the same unhurried precision she had shown in the dining room, which he suspected was not ease, but rather the performance of ease, rigorously maintained. She did not see him until she had rounded the corner and nearly walked into his chest. She stopped. She did not drop the scuttles. Her eyes came up to his face with a directness that was involuntary and immediately suppressed, replaced in less than a second by the flatness of professional neutrality. They were gray-green. Her eyes, the color of river water in November. "Forgive me, my lord," she said in a voice that was quiet and clear and entirely without affect. "Set those down," he said. "I am quite able, my lord." "They are nearly delivered." I said, "Set them down." A pause. Not the pause of a servant being insubordinate, the pause of a person choosing, carefully, which truth to honor. She set the scuttles down beside the skirting board with the same deliberate care she gave everything. "Thank you," he said. She did not answer because he had not said anything that required an answer. She picked the scuttles back up and continued down the corridor without looking at him again. He stood where he was for a moment after she had rounded the second corner. The corridor smelled of coal dust and beeswax polish. Somewhere below, a clock was striking 8. He had not been warm precisely in a very long time. He did not know what to call the thing that had just moved through him. He knew only that it was inconvenient, and that he did not intend to act on it, and that he watched the empty end of the corridor for somewhat longer than he needed to, before he turned and went into the morning room. The kitchen passage ran between the scullery and the servants' entrance, a narrow corridor of whitewashed stone that smelled of tallow and bread in the particular cold that comes off stone floors regardless of the season. Cicely had spent a significant portion of the past 5 months in this passage. She had come to understand it as one of the few places in Lady Eugenia's house where she was not required to be invisible, where her presence was, in fact, expected and functional, and there was a grim comfort in that. It was in this passage, on the 4th morning of the Marquess's visit, that Lady Eugenia came to find her. Cicely was blacking the kitchen stove when she heard the footsteps. She knew Lady Eugenia's footsteps the way she knew every sound in the house, the particular crisp tap of heeled slippers on stone, the brief pause at the passage entrance while the eyes adjusted. She did not stop working. "Put that down," Lady Eugenia said. Cicely put the blacking brush down and turned. Lady Eugenia was holding a sealed letter. She was dressed already, in a visiting gown of deep plum silk, the diamonds at her throat, even at this hour the black lace gloves perfectly smooth on her hands. She looked at Cicely the way she always looked at her, with the efficient appraisal one gives to something that is required to be useful and has not yet ceased to be. "You will take this to Lord Ashcroft's steward," Lady Eugenia said. "Mr. Cupper. Greenley. He is staying at the White Hart. You will deliver it this morning, before 9. Cicely took the letter. She looked at it. The direction on the front was written in Lady Eugenia's hand. "Mr. Greenley, on behalf of the Marquess of Ashcroft." The seal was pressed into blue wax. She had carried enough of Lady Eugenia's letters to know that letters with blue wax seals, directed to gentlemen of business, generally contained requests for money. She did not know what business Lady Eugenia had with Dorian Blackwell's steward. She had a feeling, cold and very clear in her chest, that the letter's contents were not her concern. The feeling was correct as a matter of station. It was not correct as a matter of the thing she had been considering since she picked the letter up, which was the signature at the bottom of its contents, or rather the name that had been cited therein. She did not have to open the letter to understand what it said. Lady Eugenia's purpose in sending it was visible in her face. The Marquess had a young ward, a boy of 13 named Thomas, living at Ashcroft Park. Lady Eugenia had mentioned the boy 3 times in the past 4 days, each time with a particular careful attention. If the letter implicated Thomas in a fabricated debt, and if Greenley were convinced to report the matter to the Marquess as fact, the leverage it would give Lady Eugenia over a man who wished to protect his ward's reputation would be significant. This was inference. Cicely could not know it with certainty. She could know it well enough. She looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at Lady Eugenia. "I will not take it," she said. The silence was very short and very complete. "I beg your pardon," Lady Eugenia said. "I will not take this letter to Mr. Greenley." Lady Eugenia's face went through several expressions quickly, like pages being turned. The last expression that settled there was the one Cicely knew best from the past 5 months. The one that was not anger but something much calmer and much more considered than anger. "You will do as you are told," Lady Eugenia said, "or you will find yourself without even the roof you are currently ungrateful enough to take for granted." "Then I am without it," Cicely said. She set the letter on the stone windowsill. She turned back to the stove and picked up the blacking brush. The blow came across her left cheek, open-handed. It was not the first time. She had learned not to flinch. Her head turned with the force of it, and she held very still for a moment, her face toward the window, and the gray October light beyond it, and she did not make any sound. What she could not have known was that the servant's entrance at the end of the passage had opened 40 seconds earlier, that the Marquess of Ashcroft, returning from an early walk, had come through the side garden and entered through that door because the front steps were being swept, and he did not care about the convention of his own entrance sufficiently to wait, that he had stopped in the passage when he heard Lady Eugenia's voice and had stood there, still as carved stone, and heard every word of it, that he had seen the blow, that he had seen Cecily's stillness afterward, that he had seen her turn back to the stove and go on working. He did not come forward, he did not speak. He stood at the dark end of the passage, and he watched Cecily work the brush along the cast iron in careful, steady strokes until Lady Eugenia's heels had clicked away toward the stairs. And then he stood there for a moment longer. And then he turned and went back out through the servants' entrance, and, to the considerable confusion of the footman who let him in, he said nothing about what he had seen. That afternoon he called on his solicitor in Bath. Mr. Sake Carruthers had served the Blackwell family for 22 years, which meant he had served Dorian since his majority and had long since learned to read, in the particular quality of his employer's silences, what a younger solicitor might have required speech to understand. When the Marquess sat down across from him in the small office on Milsom Street and said, "Tell me what you know of Sir Harold Ashmore's estate, Mr." Carruthers heard something beneath the request that the words themselves did not name, and he gave the question the specific gravity it deserved. It took him 2 hours. He had contacts in the right offices. He sent 2 notes and received replies. Sir Harold Ashmore, Baronet, deceased February of that year, had left 1 daughter, Cecily Margaret Ashmore, aged 23. The estate in Wiltshire had been entailed to male issue and had passed to a cousin. However, Sir Harold had held a separate property in trust for his daughter, a modest sum, not a fortune but sufficient for a gentlewoman to live with dignity, which had been placed in the care of the widow, Lady Eugenia Ravenscroft, in accordance with the terms of a codicil that predated the baronet's marriage to Lady Eugenia by only 3 months. The codicil was worded in such a way that the funds were to be managed on Miss Ashmore's behalf until such time as she married or reached the age of 30. It was Mr. Plack's. Carruthers said carefully, a codicil whose terms were being interpreted with considerable latitude by the current manager. He said it carefully. He was a careful man. He did not say the word misappropriation. He said latitude. Dorian sat with this for a long time. Outside the office window, Bath went about its autumn business, and he looked at the street without seeing it, and he thought about a girl in a gray cotton dress, carrying 2 coal scuttles down a corridor, at 8 in the morning, and about the sound of an open hand across a cheek, and about the particular quality of the stillness afterward. He thought about his wife Helena. He had not permitted himself to think about her in this office, or in any room that was not his study at Ashcroft Park, for the better part of a year. She came now because she wanted to, the way she always had, on her own terms and in her own time. Dark-haired, quick to laugh, alone in the great bedroom while the snow came down outside and he was still on the road from Yorkshire, still 3 hours away, the road slower than he had been told, slower than he had believed when he had told himself he would make it back before the hour arrived. He had not made it back. He had arrived to silence and to a face already composed in the specific quiet that comes after great effort is finished. He had kept her portrait turned to the wall since the spring of that year. Not from grief, exactly. From a kind of complicated guilt that had no name yet, that he had not been able to look at squarely. He sat in the solicitor's office, and he thought that there were things a person could do, or failed to do, that could not be made right afterward. He had learned this as thoroughly as he had ever learned anything. He also thought that there were things a person could do, or fail to do, in the present moment, and that the cost of inaction was not always suffered by the person who chose it. Perhaps you are wondering by now what a man like this does with a knowledge like that. So was he. Stay with the story a little longer. He returned to Lady Eugenia's townhouse in time for the evening meal. He said nothing at dinner that could have been interpreted as anything. He ate the soup and the fish and the game pie, and he answered Lady Eugenia's questions about Ashcroft Park with the minimal sufficiency she had learned to accept in lieu of warmth, and he watched Dorinda Ravenscroft make intelligent conversation about the concerts at the assembly rooms, and he noted that Cecily did not appear at the table at all. Not as a serving girl. Not as anything. She was, presumably, in the kitchen. He said nothing. After dinner in the smoking room, he stood at the window with a glass he did not drink and considered what he intended to do and whether he intended to do it. He was a man who had been still for 3 years. Not inactive exactly, but still in the way of a person who has decided that a certain kind of action carries a cost he cannot bear again and has therefore decided not to act in that direction. He had managed his estate. He had discharged his obligations. He had visited his ward Thomas at school and sat with him over mathematics and spoken with the boys' tutors and done all the things a man with responsibilities is expected to do. He had not, in 3 years, allowed himself to want something for himself. There was a girl in this house who was being robbed of everything that was hers, and was responding by carrying coal scuttles with great care and refusing to send false letters. And something about that, the specific quality of her refusal, the silence she had maintained with the stove blacking brush. And he was standing at this window because he was trying to determine whether it was principle that made him want to act or something else, and whether the distinction mattered, and what he was going to do about Lady Eugenia. He put the glass down. He had decided which was a thing he had not done in a long time, and the decision sat in his chest with a peculiar steadiness that was not entirely unlike peace. 3 days later, Lady Eugenia made her move. Why? She had been watching him. She was a woman of considerable political intelligence, and she had seen enough in the past week to understand that something had gone wrong with her plan, though she could not have identified its precise nature. The Marquess had not looked at Dorinda with any expression that could be called interest. He had looked, when he thought he was unobserved, at the attic stairs. He had asked the footman once an innocuous question about the household staffing, which was not a thing a guest asked unless he was looking for information about a particular member of it. She could not be certain. She had decided not to wait until she was. She called Cecily to her private sitting room on a Thursday morning. "I have arranged a situation for you," she said. "Mrs. Alderton in the village of Coombe requires a live-in companion. She is an elderly widow with good taste and a predictable temper. You will go on Monday." Cecily stood with her hands at her sides and her face level, and said, "I understand." "You will not discuss the terms of this arrangement with anyone in the household," Lady Eugenia said. "It would be unkind to create a fuss." "I understand," Cecily said again. She went upstairs to the attic room, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she looked at the gray light coming through the single window, and she held the small Virgil in both hands, and did not open it. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she stood up and began to fold her things. She had almost nothing to fold. The gray dress was on her back. She had one other, slightly less gray. She had the Virgil. She had a handkerchief that had been her mother's. She had a pair of worn leather gloves that were not adequate for the weather but were better than nothing. She folded them carefully and put them in the small bag that had been her father's. She smoothed the counterpane. She looked at the room. It had been a terrible room, and she had kept it as clean and as ordered as she was able, and she felt, standing in it now, a complicated sorrow that was not exactly grief for the room, but was grief for something, for the 5 months that had happened in it, for all the care she had expended on a house that was not hers. For a father who had given her a Virgil and died in February. She went downstairs to the kitchen to finish out the afternoon. That evening, at dinner, Dorinda Ravenscroft looked down the table at the footman, who had replaced Cecily at the service, and said to the woman sitting beside her, in a voice calibrated to carry, Lady Ashford was asking after the rag girl. I told her not to trouble herself. She has gone to be a companion, somewhere perfectly suited to her. She laughed, a small, polite laugh that the woman beside her echoed. The table did not notice. 2 nights later, at the card table set up in the East Room for a small evening party, Lord Trevin was dealing to Lady Milborough and the Honourable Mr. Rosper. Fitchin said without particular malice, "Has anyone seen Eugenia's rag girl lately? I heard she has packed her off to Coombe, pity. She was an interesting little thing to look at in her way." He meant this as something approaching a compliment. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man for whom certain women existed as objects of interest rather than as persons, which amounts to much the same result. Potts, who was not a member of either the card table or the evening party, but who was standing in the doorway with a tray and had ears that functioned precisely well, heard every word of it and turned back to the kitchen with the tray still in her hands and thought of the girl who had been gone these 4 days and who had left the kitchen tidier than it had ever been under the previous cook's management. Mrs. Potts had not been in Lady Eugenia's employ. She was, in fact, in the Marquess of Ashcroft's employ. She had accompanied his household to Bath for the duration of his visit and had been assisting in Lady Eugenia's kitchen as a matter of practical arrangement. She went the following morning to speak with the Marquess. He had already sent for Mr. Carruthers. He was drinking cold coffee at the writing desk in his borrowed study when Mrs. Potts knocked and entered, and he listened to everything she had to say with an expression that was not readable, but that Mrs. Potts, after 30 years of watching this family's faces, understood to mean that he had already known most of it, and was deciding what to do with the rest. "Combe," he said. "That is 12 miles. "Yes, my lord," she said. "I thought you should know it." "Thank you, Mrs. Potts." She went. He picked up the cold coffee and put it down without drinking it. Mr. Carruthers arrived within the hour because Carruthers had long since learned to arrive within the hour. Dorian was at the door of the rented cottage in Coombe by 5:30 the following morning. It was a grey October dawn, the hedgerows still dark against a sky that had not quite decided to be light, and the cottage itself was small and neat and belonged to a Mrs. Simma Alderton, who kept early hours and had not yet come down when the carriage stopped on the lane outside. A window on the upper floor showed candlelight. He stood in the lane and waited. She opened the front door after a few minutes, wearing the slightly less grey dress and the worn leather gloves, and a look on her face that had been composure until she saw who was standing there, whereupon it became something more complicated and less controlled, a flicker of something she had not allowed herself before taking hold again. "My lord," she said. "Come back to Bath," he said. A pause. She looked at him steadily. "Lady Eugenia has arranged for me to be here," she said. "I think she would prefer me to remain." "I have no doubt of it," he said. She looked at him. He could see her doing the arithmetic of the situation, weighing what he was asking against what it would cost her to refuse him, which was not a thing she owed him, and against what it would cost her to agree to him, which was not clear yet. Her face did the arithmetic very quietly. "What are you offering?" she said. It was a question of exceptional directness from a girl in worn gloves standing in a cottage doorway at dawn, and he respected it entirely. "My protection," he said, "and Mr. Carruthers and the truth of your father's estate presented to the appropriate parties." She was very still for a moment. "And the rest," he said. "We will speak of it when you are not standing in a doorway in November, cold." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze, and did not look away, and the grey dawn light lay across both of them without favoring either. "I will need to tell Mrs. Alderton," she said. "Of course," he said. She turned back into the house. He stood in the lane and watched the horizon go from grey to pale, and thought about what he had just said, and about Helena's portrait turned to the wall, and about the specific quality of her face when she was doing the arithmetic of whether to trust someone, and about whether he deserved to be trusted yet. And about the fact that whether he deserved it or not, she had said yes. She came out 20 minutes later with the small bag and the worn gloves and the Virgil held against her ribs. He handed her up into the carriage himself. Mr. Carruthers had worked quickly, because Mr. Carruthers was the kind of solicitor who understood that some matters are most efficiently resolved before the opposing party has had time to prepare. By the time they reached Bath, it had been arranged that Cecily would stay as a guest in the house of Mrs. Pemberton, a respectable widow of Mr. Ferks. Carruthers' acquaintance, and that Lady Eugenia's management of Sir Harold Ashmore's trust would be examined with considerable thoroughness by a set of independent eyes with the appropriate credentials. The examination had not yet occurred. The evidence had already been gathered. There remained the matter of the dining room. Lady Eugenia had not been idle in the 4 days of Cecily's absence. She had written the announcement to the Bath newspaper, and had it held, pending one conversation with the Marquess, which she had not yet been able to arrange, because the Marquess had developed in the past week a quality of cool and purposeful unavailability that she found impossible to breach without showing her hand. She arranged a dinner. She invited 14 guests, including Lord Trevane and Lady Milborough, and a senior peer of her acquaintance, Sir Francis Welling, who served as a kind of procedural gravity for any announcement made in his presence. She seated Dorinda at the Marquess's right hand. She composed her own expression into something warm and entirely confident. He had not told her that Cecily would be there. He had not told her anything. She looked up when the door opened at the quarter hour after the first course, and she saw Cecily Ashmore in a borrowed cream empire waistgown with simple ribbon at the hem, and she went very still, and then she collected herself with admirable speed and smiled the particular smile she used for problems that were about to be solved. She said before the Marquess could speak, "Miss Ashmore, how unexpected! I had understood your arrangement with Mrs. Alderton to be a settled thing." "Lady Eugenia," Cecily said. She did not say anything else because she did not need to. She had not come to speak. The Marquess of Ashcroft set his napkin on the table and stood. The room, which had been in the careful hum of second-course conversation, went quiet, the way rooms go quiet, when a very large and very still thing moves. He was not a man who drew the eye through any performance. He was a man who drew it through an absolute economy of motion that made every movement he made feel precisely chosen. And he was choosing now to stand, which meant that something was about to happen. Lady Eugenia's hand did not move on the table. Her face did not change. "I had hoped," she said pleasantly, "to have a private word with you, my lord, about a matter concerning my daughter. Miss Ashmore is my betrothed." "I will hear nothing further." The 12 words landed in a room that had no more air in it. Lady Eugenia looked at him. Something in her face moved, not all at once. In stages, the way ice moves on a river when the temperature changes, the separate pieces shifting without any single piece breaking, until you realize the surface that had seemed solid is not solid at all. "I beg your pardon," she said. She said it very quietly. "You have heard me," he said. He did not sit back down. Dorinda Ravenscroft, at his right hand, looked first at her mother, and then at Cecily, and then at the tablecloth, and the expression on her face was not malice. It was recognition. She had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and this was the first moment she had understood that it had never been a fact. Lord Trevane, who had said what he had said at the card table and had not thought much about it since, looked at Cecily in the cream gown and then at the Marquess, and said, into the silence, "Well?" He said it the way a man says a word when he is recalculating something. Lady Milborough beside him looked at Cecily with the particular attention of a woman who has watched fashions in misfortune for 50 years and knows a thing when she sees it reversed. Sir Francis Welling at the end of the table set down his glass. "Ashcroft," he said, "am I to understand the announcement is formal?" "It is formal," Dorian said. "Then allow me to be the first to offer my congratulations," Sir Francis said, and raised his glass and the table moved, slowly, the way it always eventually does, in the direction of the person who has made his position clear and does not appear to regret it. Lady Eugenia did not fragment all at once. She was too composed for that, and too proud. What she did was smaller and more telling. Her hand on the table turned over. Just that. Her palm, which had been pressed flat against the tablecloth, opened upward as though something had left it. Cicely stood very still in the doorway and felt the room turn in her direction the way rooms turn when a verdict changes. Slowly and irrevocably, the temperature shifting before the light does. She looked at Dorian. He was still standing. He looked back at her in the way he had looked at her across the dining room on the very first evening of his visit, with that quality of attention that had no pity in it, and she felt, for the first time in 5 months, the specific sensation of being seen. She did not cry. She stood very straight and let the room settle around her and breathed. Mr. Carruthers appeared in the doorway at a quiet signal and was admitted, and the papers he carried were of the kind that make certain things very difficult to undo. Lady Eugenia looked at the papers. She looked at Sir Francis Welling. She looked at the room. She said nothing. She was a woman who had always known when the game had moved past her hand. By the end of the evening it was, in every sense that Bath used to measure such things, done. 3 weeks later, in the sitting room at Ashcroft Park, the fire burned low and well in a grate that smelled of applewood, and the first real November snow had been falling outside the window for the better part of an hour, settling softly on the park grounds and on the gray stone of the house's facade, and on the bare upper branches of the chestnut tree that Dorian had said, once, very briefly, that Helena had loved for its particular shape against the winter sky. Cicely had listened when he said it, and had not looked away, and had said quietly, "She must have understood this house well." "She did," he said. They had been in the study when he said it, the study with the fireplace and the writing desk, and the 2 chairs and the mantelpiece on which the portrait of Helena Blackwell, née Cartwright, had been kept since her marriage to him, and which had been turned to the wall since the spring before last. It stood now facing the room. Cicely had not turned it. She had not suggested it. She had sat in the chair beside the fire and read the Virgil for 20 minutes while he went through the week's correspondence, and then she had looked up at the mantelpiece and said, "If you wanted to, you could turn it back around. She belonged to this house. There is room for that." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had stood and turned the portrait around. Helena Blackwell looked out at the room with dark hair and an expression of composed amusement. And the fire did what fires do to candlelight and faces, and neither of them said anything for a while. Now, in the sitting room, Cicely had the Virgil open on the small table beside her chair. The worn spine, held gently, the pages open to a passage her father had marked in pencil. A line about endurance and the thing that waits on the other side of it. She had not read it yet. She was watching the snow. Dorian came in from the hall and stood for a moment in the doorway and looked at her. She was wearing the cream gown still because Mrs. Poor. Pemberton had been generous, and her own wardrobe would require time to arrange, and the firelight caught the ribbon at the hem, and the particular angle of her profile and the loose strand of dark hair she had not bothered to tuck back. She looked, he thought, like someone who had learned to sit in a room without holding herself against it. And he understood what that cost and what it meant that she had let it go. He came and sat in the chair beside hers. She turned from the window to look at him. The gray-green of her eyes was warm in the firelight. "Mrs. Potts," she said, "has threatened to make the treacle pudding. She threatens it every week," he said. "Eventually she always does. Then we have something to look forward to." He reached across the arm of the chair and laid his hand over hers. She turned her hand under his and held it. Outside, the snow went on falling, settling on the park and on the stone and on the chestnut tree, and the fire did not go out, and the small Virgil lay open on the table, with its penciled margin notes and its worn spine and all the patience it had carried from one hand to another, waiting to be read. She was home.